Ja, meine lieben Damen und Herren, ich möchte mich ganz herzlich bedanken bei Ihnen, Frau Dickmann, bei der WCB und alle, die hier sein heute. Ich freue mich sehr, wieder in Berlin zu sein und fühle mich geehrt, diese Auszeichnung zu erhalten. Vielen Dank. Allow me also to express a special thanks to Shu Kai-chan, who with his wife Angela made this award possible. Suchai has been an extraordinary global entrepreneur. As we heard earlier from his son, he's also a serious thinker, published a book called Social Capitalism, which very much relates to some of the crises that we face today, and we can all learn from that book. Best of all, he and his young wife of 95, and he's 98, are in good spirits. I saw that video was being taken, and I hope they see this, and if they do, Suchan and Angela, on behalf of my wife Mary, myself, and everyone here, we thank you for all your contributions. Thank you. I get the sense that this prize recognizes not only my work, but also the larger message that it represents, that we are a planet and a people in some difficulty. One of the greatest challenges that we face these days is to address in serious ways the backlash against globalization, the backlash against openness, the other and the us, building bridges between them. The announcement of the award mentions some strands of my academic work which relate to this challenge, and also very kindly the policy work that I had the opportunity to do at the United Nations, thanks to the imagination and leadership of Kofi Annan, not only my favorite boss, but one of my dearest friends. Perhaps if I could sketch out some of the analytical framing in the academic work and then show how it related to the policy work, it certainly is not going to solve all of our problems, but it may give some sense of some approaches which do work, as Frau Dickmann was very kind to say. The relevant academic work really began when I tried as a young scholar to understand better how the capitalist countries learned to combine the efficiency of markets with the broader values and institutional practices of community, of social community. These are required by sustainable markets themselves, otherwise they won't be sustainable. And that is the trajectory that we seem to be on today. Now, the historical record is not hugely encouraging. It took the capitalist countries a long time to learn that lesson. It took the collapse of the Victorian era version of globalization, followed by World War I, extreme left-wing revolutions in China, extreme right-wing revolutions in Italy and Germany, militarism in Japan, and unprecedented international financial volatility, the shriveling up of world trade in the 1930s, and the Great Depression. Nor was that the end of it. The social strains produced by those developments and those upheavals were so powerful that the world descended into yet a second world war in the span of a single generation. It was out of that historic upheavals that the new lesson finally took root. It was a new social understanding that was described by different names in different countries. In the United States, we called it the New Deal state. Elsewhere, including Germany, it was the social market economy or social democracy. But the underlying idea was the same: a grand social bargain whereby all sectors of society agreed to open international markets, which in some cases had become heavily administered in the interwar years, but also to share in the social adjustment costs that open markets inevitably generate. Now, governments played a key role in enacting and sustaining this grand compromise, which, for lack of a better name, I called embedded liberalism. And what I meant by that was the liberalism part consisted of progressively reducing barriers to transactions across borders. And the embeddedness part included moderating the volatility of those flows and making sure that if there were significant adverse impacts on economic sectors or on people, those would be compensated for. And so you had a balanced system between international openness and domestic community. It was enshrined, this framework was enshrined in multilateral principles, norms, and institutions. And it produced the longest and most equitable period of economic growth in the capitalist world in history. Now, even as I was writing my first academic paper on this subject in the 1980s, I realized that the grand compromise was beginning to fray. And I predicted that what later became known as neoliberalism would emerge as the dominant ideational, normative, and institutional template of economic governance. And so it did in many parts of the world. But in the process, the commitment to domestic policies to help offset the adverse effects of international liberalization steadily declined in favor of building global systems. This was particularly true in the Anglo-American world, sowing seeds for movements that later led to Brexit and Trump. Now, of course, globalization has produced significant positive results around the world, but it has also created a gaping mismatch, a mismatch between the scope and impact of economic forces and actors, on the one hand, and the capacity of societies to manage their adverse consequences. Shared values and institutional practices to embed global economic forces and actors remained weak, and in some areas, including workers' rights and bargaining power, they actually became weaker. It was at that point that Kofi Annan took office as Secretary General of the United Nations and invited me to join his team. He shared the view that the business sector needed to play a far greater and more positive role if globalization itself was to be socially and environmentally sustainable. But at the United Nations, you have only what my colleague Joe Nye calls soft power. And believe me, having worked for the United Nations for more than a decade, it's very soft. But you have to work with the tools that you have. You can't assume that you have tools. Economists might do that. They might have a can of beans and say, assume a can opener. But those of us who don't share that approach to social science have to use the tools that we have available. Now, Kofi Annan in January 1999 was invited to give a keynote speech at the World Economic Forum in Davos. He both warned and challenged the assembled business leaders. This is what he said. History teaches us that a foundational imbalance between the economic, social, and political realms can never be sustained for very long. Our challenge today is to devise a social compact on the global scale to underpin the new global economy. But of course, the United Nations by itself could not simply establish a true compact on a global scale. So we tried something more modest. And it was the thing called the Global Compact. And we called it that more as a signal of what was necessary than a specific goal that was imminently achievable. I'd like to take a few minutes to describe the conception behind the Global Compact. It really consisted of three functions or three parts. The first was as a learning forum, a peer learning forum. I often described it as the little red schoolhouse of globalization for global companies, for civil society, for workers' organizations. As a learning forum, the Compact has sought to establish and promote shared understandings of responsible business conduct, including human rights, labor standards, and environmental protection. In that 1999 speech, Davos said, don't wait to the business leaders, don't wait for every country to introduce laws. You can use these universal values of the United Nations as the cement binding together your global corporations, since they are values that people all over the world will recognize as their own. Now, how does one go about teaching companies to do something like that? With difficulty. But we had a model of sorts. Learning, institutional learning, has a number of parts. One is stimulating new cognitive frames, new ways of looking at issues at hand. Then acting on that understanding. So applied to the concept of responsible business conduct, the first step we could describe as error correction. You're making mistakes, stop making mistakes. And one way to stop making mistakes is to adopt new policies, new codes, and the like. And that's the first thing that the Global Compact tried to do. Secondly, a more advanced step involves making changes in the company's institutional routines, incentives, and performance standards. That is more outcome-oriented than input-oriented. Most ambitious is a paradigm shift whereby a company becomes a norm entrepreneur in its own right by developing socially inclusive and environmentally sustainable business practices, and perhaps begins to drive transformative change in its entire sector. And there are such companies in the world today. I mention only one because its CEO has been the leader of this paradigm shift since the beginning, and that's Paul Polman of Unilever, who through the Sustainable Living Plan has developed not simply a CSR program, but a new business model. By investing in the communities in which we operate in our supply chain, not only do they benefit, we benefit because they are tomorrow's customers. We live in the world of 2 billion in our market today. There are 8 billion in in the world, we want to get deeper. We can't get deeper with our existing business models. We need new business models. The Global Compact also was an incubator for, or has been, still is, an incubator for new initiatives. One of them, Klaus Topfer is here, was done with the UN Environment Program. And that was to start the Principles for Responsible Investment, which is today a freestanding entity of something like 1,700 institutional investors in over 50 countries, representing $65 trillion under management. The signatories make 3 commitments: to incorporate environmental, social, and corporate governance criteria into their investment analysis and decision-making. Second, to being active owners and including the same commitments into ownership policies and practices. And third, to seek ESG, or environmental, social, and governance disclosure by the companies in which they invest. Finally, the Compact also has promoted public-private partnerships on the recognition, as Kofi used to like to say, all hands need to be on deck. States can't do this alone, the UN can't do this alone, the business sector can't do it alone, civil society can't do it alone. We need to bring them together in focused efforts. One of the very first of these public-private partnerships, in fact, involved Deutsche Post, DHL, and the UN Humanitarian Relief Program. The UN dealt with the government side of things, and DHL employs its core competency in logistics to help support disaster preparedness and response efforts. Today, the central focus of the Compact is promoting business support for the Sustainable Development Goals. So this, as I said at the outset, this kind of initiative does not fix all the problems that we face in the world today, whether as a result of globalization or other things, but it does make a difference on the ground where it matters. The other initiative, and I'll be brief here, is the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. That journey, as was noted, began in 2005. A treaty-like effort to govern multinational corporations under international law fell apart, and the Secretary General was asked to appoint a special representative to start a process that might lead to some accepted outcome. And the outcome was the guiding principles, 31 in all, each with commentary elaborating their implications for law, for policy, and for practice. They acquired a sort of soft law status when they were endorsed unanimously by the UN Human Rights Council in 2011. Here again, let me just mention sort of 2 ideas that helped drive the process. The first was the recognition and acting upon that when you look out at the world of multinational corporations, you really see 3 distinct governance systems at work. Their conduct is shaped by 3 distinct governance systems. The first is the traditional system of public law and government, national and international through treaty processes and the like. Important as that is by itself, it has been unable to do all of the heavy lifting that we require in this day and age. The second is a system of civil governance. Civil society made itself into a global governance actor starting in the 1980s and 1990s in parallel with corporate globalization itself. Civil governance works by employing such social compliance mechanisms as advocacy campaigns, lawsuits, and other forms of pressure, but also partnering with companies to induce positive change. The third system of governance is corporate governance, which internalizes elements of the other two as risks, constraints, and opportunities. So the intellectual and policy challenge there was to construct a normative framework whereby these three governance systems become more closely aligned, that they begin to focus on similar things and act in a way that becomes mutually supportive rather than incoherent. And so, for example, we put forward fundamental concepts like the need for companies to conduct human rights due diligence. Companies liked the concept because due diligence is something they understand. We simply expanded the notion to include impact on people rather than simply impact on the bottom line, on the understanding that really adverse impacts on people will eventually impact your bottom line, but better to find out ahead of time and avoid it altogether. So companies like the idea of human rights due diligence. Governments like the idea of human rights due diligence because now they could actually require companies to do something that was practical rather than trying to create a global constitutional system to govern multinational corporations. Civil society liked the idea because conducting human rights due diligence obviously means more preventative steps that reduce adverse human rights impacts in the first place. Another simple idea that went along with the guiding principles, which I think in this day and age we need to consider very seriously, is if you want people to be in with you on the landing, they have to be on board with you at the takeoff. You can't simply parachute into a place and expect people to do what you tell them to do. The reason that developing the guiding principles took 6 years and nearly 50 international consultations is because everybody was on board for the takeoff. Business was there, civil society was there, governments were there, other international standard-setting bodies, the European Union, ISO, a number of the International Finance Corporation, they were all there. And so there was a collective, a joint production, if you will, of the core ideas, which in turn were incorporated into the mission of those different organizations as they then go about their activities. It's never fully replicated, it's never fully the same, except for the OECD, which took our human rights principles verbatim, but the others drew on them, and in the end, there was very little disagreement, and therefore the governments felt very comfortable endorsing this unanimously. Why wouldn't they? Now, what has happened since is that this has actually had stronger legs than I would have anticipated, and I think it is in part because everybody was in for the takeoff. And so when questions arose, what do we do about such and such a problem related to human rights? The answer was, well, there's these guiding principles. You should try to work with them. The most unusual, you figure that governments will do that and that international agencies will do that, but the most unusual was FIFA. Our dear corrupt friend, FIFA, in the midst of their corruption crises, they also discovered they had a human rights crisis. stemming in part from having awarded a World Cup to Russia, which had adopted anti-gay legislation, land grabs for building stadiums and the like, but even more so Qatar, which essentially employs bonded labor to basically run their country, build everything that is built. So FIFA was feeling pressure not only from the NGO community, which of course they took seriously, but from their sponsors, which they took much more seriously. And so Coca-Cola, Adidas, other companies were putting pressure on FIFA. You must adopt human rights principles. And FIFA said, what is that? And so Coca-Cola, which was in at the takeoff of the original journey, and Adidas, who were also there, said, well, there's these guiding principles. So I get a call in August of 2015 from Zurich. Would I please come to Zurich? It was a Tuesday. Can you be here by Thursday? We need your help. The end result of all of that is that FIFA has adopted a new statutory provision to respect all internationally recognized human rights. It has established a human rights advisory board, which includes NGOs, workers' organizations, and the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And it has included human rights criteria in future World Cup bidding requirements. So when a country that wishes to host a World Cup submits its bid, it has to include a plan for how it would deal with human rights issues that may come up in the process. UEFA, by the way, has done exactly the same thing and has also included human rights criteria for the Euro 2024 tournament. I don't know if any of them will give me free tickets, but I think I deserve them. So let me draw these remarks to a close. We have a long way to go. When I first presented the guiding principles to the Human Rights Council in 2011, I said, I'm under no illusion that this is the end. I'm under no illusion that this is the beginning of the end. But I do believe that is the end of the beginning, because for once we have a common framework, a common vocabulary, and a common action plan that different actors have bought into. Ultimately, the lesson that needs to become second nature to all of us, whether politician, corporate leader, or citizen, is this: there can be no viable society without a sustainable business sector. But there can be no sustainable business sector that does not respect and contribute to the social fabric in which it operates. To quote Kofi Annan one last time, my friends, the simple fact of the matter is this: if we cannot make globalization work for all, in the end, it will work for none. Thank you very much.